Hey everybody, a lot of the times when you're making bags and stuff, you'll have the choice to just do a burnished edge, or maybe you want to do something else. In this video we're going to talk about doing an edge binding, and that's basically just a way for you to finish an edge without just doing a burnish. It looks a little bit like this. So this is an edge binding. You have croc skin here and an edge binding. We have an edge binding along this seam here and an edge binding along our pocket, like this. Now, I like to do edge binding on my bags because, just kind of look at it, it looks really nice. But also, it's a way to finish off if you have a material like a alligator or crocodile that doesn't really burnish up. It kind of lowers it down a little bit so that you can wear it with like jeans and a t-shirt. It doesn't look super fancy, even though it is still the same nice material. So, I have a pocket to a sample that I'm making. That's why I'm just using not bad, but it's just a little bumpy. And I'm gonna bind this edge, so I figured, why don't we do a little tutorial, and I'll show you how to do the edge binding, because it's really simple. And if you can sew an edge, then you can bind an edge. So really the only thing we need to make an edge binding is leather that's thin enough to bind our edges. This is a 2.5 to 3 ounce leather. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a strap cutter. I like this is like pretty much specifically my edge binding and edge piping strap cutter. It's a little bit smoother to use because it's this smooth plastic, and the buckle guy makes their own blades, and they're just so sharp that it's really easy to get a nice strip cut out of thinner leather like this. The first thing we need to do though is figure out how wide we want our edge banding to be. In order to figure out the width of our edge banding, we need a couple of numbers. 2 of these numbers are going to be solid throughout our whole piece, and 1 is going to change depending on the thickness of the leather that we're adding our edge binding to. The first is what I like to call the inside seam. That's going to be the distance from the edge to the stitch line on the piece that is getting bound. So this is going to be the inside layer. We're going to take that measurement with our calipers and then measure it out. I'm going to use the metric system because it's just easier to do. And that's 5 mil. So first thing we need to do is remember 5 mil. The next measurement we need, we're going to go to this piece here, is what do we want the stitch distance to be on? We're going to call this our outside seam because it's the one that we're going to see. This is the distance between the edge of our edge banding and the stitch line itself. Now you can use this distance to manipulate what your edge banding looks like. Do you want your stitching to be more traditional towards the seam? Do you want it to be a little funky and be right in the middle? You can do pretty much whatever you want. I like to have my stitching towards the edge, just a nice traditional look. So I'm going to use my standard stitch distance of 3.5 mils. So we have a 5 mil stitch distance on our inside seam. We're going to just say 4 mil on our outside seam. That's 9 mil. We have a front and a back, so we're going to double that, 18. The only thing left is we need to know the thickness of the piece that we're edge binding. That's going to be the one variable on every seam in our bag. So we already have 18 mil. This is only one layer of 2 mil thick leather, so we have 20 mil. I'm going to add 2 extra millimeters just so we have a little bit of room, and we're going to have 22 mil. The other thing I like about the strap cutter is that it has metrics. So we can move this to 22 mil, and we're ready to cut our strap. The next step is going to be to punch our holes for stitching into our edge banding itself, but the first thing I want to do is create one right angle. The other side doesn't have to be a right angle, but the side that we're going to start our stitching on, it's easier if it is. So I already have my holes punched on the piece that I want to add binding to. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my outside seam measurement, so that 3.5 mil, down my edge binding here with my calipers. Lastly, I'm going to go to the end that I cut my right angle into. I'm going to add one of my stitching chisel tines over the edge. That's going to be my spacer. to make sure that this side and the other side are even. Once I've done that, I'm going to punch my holes all the way down this piece of edge binding. Now you notice I haven't measured length. It's because I only have a rough estimate. I'm just going to bind and then trim off at the end. You are going to have a little bit of waste when you're working like this, but that's also kind of one of the reasons that all of these luxury details are just that, right? They take more material, they take more time, and you are going to have a little bit of waste at the end. It's just kind of part of the game because it's very difficult to measure when you have different thicknesses of leather, different shapes, etc. And it's not just per design, it's per piece. Because unless you are skiving every single piece of leather that you're using exact, in which case you probably don't need this tutorial, you're never going to have the same measurements on little details like this, like edge piping, etc. It's always going to be bespoke. It's always going to be custom made to the piece when you're doing it by hand. Now keep in mind too, you can also do this on a sewing machine. They make binding feet, but you of course can do this on a sewing machine. Almost all edge binding that you see is not done by hand. So I have my pocket. This is the edge that I'm going to bind. I have my edge binding tape that we've made by hand. The last thing we need to do before we start sewing is I am going to skive a little bit of the edge that we're going to start on because I want to butt up more edge banding with it later, and so we want it as thin as possible. Now keep in mind too, I'm also going to skive all of my seams. I have a couple of needles threaded up, and to attach our binding to our seam, I'm not going to use any glue. All I'm going to do is I'm going to thread my needles through the first hole of my binding tape, through the pocket itself, and then one by one through the corresponding holes on the other side of the binding tape. Then I'm going to fold it over and pull this tight. Once we get a few stitches in, I'm going to add an alligator clip, and we're just going to start sewing. There's a little bit of extra wiggling, but it's really not that big of a deal compared to just sewing a normal seam. And I chose this pocket because it's got a curve, so you'll see you don't do anything different. You just make sure it's leather, it's not going to rip on you. Make sure you're bending this and you're using a nice thin piece of leather for your edge binding, and you're going to be good to go. So I'm going to sew up the majority of this, and then I will show you how to end your edge binding when I'm at the end. I'm going to remove my alligator clip, and remember, because this is a custom piece, I'm going to clip off the excess, and then I'm going to skive out this edge. And you don't have to skive your ends. I'm going to show you once I finish this. We'll go and look at some other pieces, and you can see other ways that you can finish off your edge binding. But for me, my next step is to simply finish sewing this pocket and get it ready to sew in the bag. And here we go. We have our nice edge binding here. Now I think one of the most important parts is getting your hammer and hammering that edge binding flat. Now we're ready to sew this onto our bag, and you can see we have our detail. Our edge binding is curved, but it didn't take much extra work at all. And we have a nice finished seam with no burnishing involved. Now, how do we finish these ends of our binding if we're not just doing the top pocket? What if we want to go around our whole thing? So here's a few ways that we can do our edge binding. The first way I want to show you is pretty much the simplest way. So this piece has two pieces of edge binding. They start in the centers. One goes down this side, one goes down this side. The way that this is finished off is very traditional. You just do a butt seam, so one ends here, one ends here, And then I have a little piece wrapped over, and it gives it a nice tidy look, and you're good to go. Same thing on the inside. It's just hidden by the closure strap. And there we go. Second way, we've seen this bag already. The second way is just a simple overlap. This is going to be kind of harder to see, but right here, I skive down one edge and I skive down the other, and I just overlap them like a shingle. That's pretty much it. I have that done the same way on this side because, again, most of my bags tend to be one piece of binding on this side, one piece of binding on this side when it comes to the edges. Now, for the pocket, you can see we have our edge binding. The reason that we skive in here is because our outside binding is going to go over top of the binding on our pocket. So you can see that's a nice smooth look. It looks very professional, but that's why we want this as thin as possible. So that's our second way, and this is honestly the way I do it most, is just do a quick overlap. You can barely see it. This is the last way to do it. This is a chest pack, and similarly, you can do a piece of edge binding on one side and the other, but I have these flaps, these wings here, to stabilize the piece. And this is actually a piece of edge binding here. It ends about there on each side. This piece of edge binding ends about here, so there's no edge binding under here because the flap is going to cover it. So you can always use other bag parts to cover your seams. And that's really one of the reasons why with this, the piping tutorial, a lot of this is open-ended because if you're doing work like this, you're getting into the highly customized, bespoke world of the craft, and you're going to want to make everything to fit the exact piece that you're making, right? So, you know, for example, this is a seam, but it's sewn in. But I wanted it to look a little bit different. I wanted it to look like a pocket, similar to this, except it has a hidden zipper there. So that is the three main ways that you're going to terminate your edge binding. And as you can see, they create very beautiful bags. Now, if you haven't tried edge binding, I highly suggest it. It's a way to really step up your craft a little bit, make things look a little more fancy. And if you have, let me know if you have any other cool techniques in the comments that I haven't shown in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.